Our topic was, do people have a right to control their own DNA samples? Alright, so this is just a general overview of what we're going to be talking about throughout this presentation. So, DNA can be used to identify criminals because every individual has their own unique genetic makeup. No two people have the same fingerprint, tongue print, eye print, so with that. The United States currently has the world's largest DNA database with over 5.6 million DNA profiles. And out of this 5.6 million profiles, most of these are serious felony offenders, but more and more are becoming parolees and probationers because new bills are being introduced every year in an attempt to increase the number of people required to provide a DNA sample in the US DNA database. Those people who have not committed a crime feel that the government requesting a DNA sample is an invasion of privacy, and basically these are the two sides, like the two opposing sides.
Okay, so we're going to start off with just a background of what we're going to be talking about. And DNA is deoxyribonucleic acid. It's made up of chromosomes, and it stores hereditary information that's passed on from offspring in all life forms. And as Taylor said, each individual has their own unique DNA sample, and it can be taken from saliva, hair samples, or blood samples. Now the purpose for DNA databases, they have multiple. One is that they collect samples that can be analyzed by the government to make a DNA profile for all individuals. Another is that it stores criminals in a system where they can be looked up if needed, later on. And databases also help prove innocence or guilt in criminal investigations. One of the DNA databases that we have is the Combined DNA Index System, or CODIS, and it's one system that began in 1998, and it was by the FBI, and it was to help assist in identification of suspects in crimes. Before databases were here, they used traditional methods to figure out suspects. This is just a graph, and it shows how many people have been entered into DNA databases over the years and how it grows. And it also compares how many innocent people, which is the blue, compared to the overall. And now I'm just going to talk about the cons of DNA databases and ways that the government is basically using them against us. The first one is just stating how it can be in the wrong hands. The database gives a lot of power and information to a small select group of people, and it's very possible that one person can do a lot of damage with information that they have. One is that it's an invasion of privacy. It can reveal personal things such as a disease or disorder, and also going to a little extreme, it could also be like someone could plant DNA at a crime scene or use it for blackmail. Another thing is that we all have unique DNA, but at times they can be similar with certain strands, which can cause innocent people to be brought in to questioning for an investigation, even when they had nothing to do with it because it would be a partial hit on the DNA database. Another one is that the database is becoming overpopulated with innocent people, and it's causing mishaps like the one that I previously stated about how the wrong people can come into question or convicting an innocent man. Because of this overpopulation, there's a greater chance of false matches. By adding people to the system and not taking any away who shouldn't be there in the first place, it can possibly rig the whole system and no justice would actually be served. And another con is that the proposition to take DNA samples from all newborns. This is just another way for the government to basically have more control over everyone right from the start. And going along with that is other things that are going a little too far, such as the newborns with DNA. There are concerns about advances in genetic testing technologies, making it possible to obtain statistical approximations of an individual's ancestry, addictive behavior such as drugs or smoking, sexual orientation, temperament, as well as other personal information. Another major con that people have brought to attention is the cost of these databases. Many believe that the cost is not worth what it is compared to the number of crimes solved in lawsuits. Another con is people worrying about whether DNA databases could harm their employment opportunities by employers noticing that they're on the DNA database and thinking that they're either a criminal or discriminating against them because of a disorder they might have. Today, jobs are already hard to get, and sometimes these databases can make them even harder. And then both of these are just two graphs that show some statistics about DNA databases. The orange one, it goes from up till 2009, and it gives an overall number of how many people are in the database, and 21.5 of those are like innocent people who have no conviction against them. And the blue one has how many crimes took place up until 2009, and 32.4% of that number had detected or criminals using the DNA databases.
Okay, so this is just a little bit of the history of the criminal DNA database. The DNA databases were first intended to help try and convict these criminals to match their DNA from the crime site. So in 1988, Colorado was the first state to require all sex offenders to provide a DNA sample to the government upon their conviction. And 2 years later, in 1990, Virginia brought in these types of criminals requiring all convicted felons along with all sex offenders to provide a DNA sample to the government. Today, all 50 states require a DNA sample from sex offenders, and 44 require one from all felons. And 13 even go as far as collecting samples from anyone that's arrested, which can include anywhere from a sex offender to a minor misdemeanor. This is a video that goes along with the history of the DNA database that shows that bills are still being introduced today to broaden the DNA database. And this, if you just put the maps over it, maybe I'll show you.
After Governor Andrew Cuomo makes his State of the State address, representatives continue to take his message to the counties and the local level. Action News reporter Matt Marco met up with a familiar face today to talk about how Cuomo's proposals will affect us here. Matt.
Yeah, we're talking about Barbara Fiala. She's now the State Department of Motor Vehicles Commissioner, and she took Cuomo's message of where he wants New York to go to our local lawmakers today. Town supervisors and other county leaders met in the legislative chambers for Fiala's regionally targeted State of the State message. Among those points, a statewide DNA database for anyone found guilty of a felony or penal law misdemeanor. Right now, the DNA database only holds information for less than half of the people convicted of a crime. Perhaps more important than being used to convict the guilty, the governor hopes this plan would exonerate the innocent.
We would be the first in the nation. That's saying something for New York. We'll lead the way and redefine and how we handle DNA.
This is not the first call in New York for a database expansion. Some say this violates the rights of citizens, but Cuomo and his staff point to this measure as a way to protect more people. As it is now, the current DNA database has provided leads in over 2,700 convictions and proven 27 people innocent of an accused crime.
Okay, so that was just to add on to that new bills are still being introduced, and the government wants to broaden the DNA database. Okay, so like Leslie was talking about all the cons to DNA databases, I'm going to talk about all the pros to DNA databases. So one of the first and kind of minor pros to the DNA database is that, say you're an employer and you're going to hire a possible potential employee, if you can get a background check on this individual, and if their name appears in the DNA database, then you know that they are like an ex-con or like a previous criminal. And it's not to say that these individuals can't change and become better people, but at least like you, the employer, would have a decent idea of what kind of person you're going to hire. And this is another minor pro to DNA databases. If a law were to be passed that all citizens were to have their DNA samples taken, this could help in the case of an accident, such as a car accident. If an individual were involved in a car accident and no family or friends were present, they could take a DNA swab of this person and help to identify them and notify their family and friends. And like Leslie was talking about, there is a negative side to this, but this is a new recent idea of DNA sampling newborns. And the most obvious reason is that because it would be so convenient, and not all people are born in hospitals, but most are, so it would be really easy to just take a swab out of their mouth or a fingerprint and put everybody into the DNA database. Researchers also say that it would be helpful because if scientists were to examine this DNA, the DNA samples of the newborns, they could possibly early diagnose the genetic diseases. DNA sampling is very reliable. It's not an eyewitness testimony or a story of a story, he said, she said. It is concrete, undeniable evidence. And the government believes by having more DNA samples in the system that more criminals will be convicted. And like I said earlier, DNA databases have long been used to solve crimes. So the two most useful ways DNA is used today is 1, solving crimes to convict criminals, and 2, solving crimes to release inmates who have been wrongly convicted, in which these are called exonerated inmates. The formal definition of DNA exoneration is the removal of a burden, charge, responsibility, duty, or blame imposed by law using DNA samples to prove an individual innocent. The first DNA exoneration took place in 1989, and there have been over 300 post-conviction DNA exonerations in the United States since that time. And of these 300, 18 people of these 300 exonerations were on death row. So they were awaiting their death, and they were innocent. Most inmates are wrongly convicted due to mistaken eyewitness testimony, which, like I said, is unreliable. A false confession, and these are due to sometimes innocent people just agree to be guilty because of police pressure, or the judge will lighten their sentence if they just plead guilty. And a jailhouse snitch will also lie sometimes just to get people in trouble. And the average length of time served by exonerates is 13.6 years, which I think that's a very long time. That's almost an entire childhood. And the total number of years served is approximately 4,013. Of those 300 exonerees together, they served 4,013 innocent hours, or years in jail, sorry. The average age of exonerees at the time of their wrongful convictions is 27. And I found it interesting that by the time, since the average is 13.6 years that they spend in jail, they're in their 40s by the time they get out. So that's kind of a rough start to go back out into the real world at 40. Okay, this video is about exonerated inmates, and they were released due to DNA sampling.
Damon Thibodeau, hours after he walked out of Louisiana's death row, a free man. His release, the outcome of a 7-year investigation that absolved Thibodeau of the rape and murder of a relative. DNA evidence discredited his confession, drawn by detectives who allegedly took advantage of his exhaustion and fed him details of the crime. Thibodeau spent 23 hours a day in solitary confinement awaiting his execution.
You start talking to people, your lawyers in particular, you start to think, hey, maybe this just isn't the end. You know, I shouldn't be here. Maybe I shouldn't just accept it. And so you start to feel some hope, and you start fighting, and then eventually this is where it leads to.
Exoneration advocates thank police and prosecutors for cooperating in review of Thibodeau's case.
When you think you have an innocent man, and people on both sides can get together and really share evidence and really conduct an investigation in the search for the truth, that's what's important.
Thibodeau was embraced by other ex-convicts who have been freed thanks to DNA evidence. His release continues a flurry of recent exonerations, and 300 in the past 2 decades. In California, John Edward Smith was released 19 years after his wrongful murder conviction for a drive-by shooting. A witness recanted his testimony. In the past 2 months, 2 others in Chicago and Texas were absolved of rape and murder thanks to new DNA analysis. Like Thibodeau, a quarter of those wrongfully convicted had given false confessions and admissions, often pressured by police to do so. But most of the wrongful convictions were the result of misidentification by eyewitnesses. And after many reports of faulty forensic examinations, the federal government has announced it will take another look at thousands of past cases. But that will take time, millions of dollars, and years of waiting by many presumed innocents languishing in prisons. Tom Ackerman, Al Jazeera.
And now going along with our prompts and to recap some of like the major issues of DNA databases. Obviously, the invasion of privacy, again, just to recap, and then innocent people getting brought into investigations, and that's just for no really substantial reason other than just their like strands just matching up partially, and that the cost is so high that people do not think that the safety benefits to society outweigh it. And along with our prompt as well, the question was asked, any circumstances that an employer should demand a DNA sample from an employee? We believe the answer is yes, and it's due to the fact that if a job is causing employees to be exposed to like chemicals or radiation, it can both cause a disease or disorder or increase the process of one that someone might already have that would be shown in their DNA sample if they got checked beforehand. This would save a lot of companies from possible lawsuits later on if someone came back after if something happened to them. And many people would not just naturally tell them because they're ashamed or they just are embarrassed at their disease or disorder. And they don't really want to be judged or treated differently. So DNA samples for like some employers would definitely be beneficial, we believe.
Okay, so this question was also asked. Should the control of DNA databases be law or between employers and insurance companies? And Leslie and I agreed that this should be by law because it's too complicated to keep track of all the individual employers and insurance companies and whose DNA is taken and whose isn't. But we said that the law should be made specific and only those jobs that are high risk, such as a pilot, those individuals should have their DNA samples taken just to see if there are any like future genetic problems that would impair them during their job. And so this is a hypothetical situation that say that you're a doctor working as a consultant for an insurance company and the insurance company comes to you and says that they want to start testing adults for cystic fibrosis alleles. And we're supposed to give advice to the insurance company of what we think about this. So if the insurance companies were to actually test the adults, they would be able to see if certain adults have the genes to possibly develop cystic fibrosis. And this would be beneficial to the individual because obviously they would find out if they have these genes. But it would also be a hindrance because the insurance companies would be very hesitant to insure them because it would cost them more money in the long run. And Leslie and I agree that even though it would cost these insurance companies more money in the long run, we said that the individual has no control over their genetic makeup, so it's not very fair to punish them for something that they can't control. And insurance companies should not be allowed to pick and choose who they insure. If an individual has the money and they have the need to buy insurance, then they should not be denied the right. And people with genetic disorders such as cystic fibrosis should be more insured, or the insurance companies should want to insure them because they're more at risk than people who don't have these disorders.
So just to conclude our presentation, we want to say that while there are many disadvantages to DNA sampling and expanding the database, we believe that the advantages definitely outweigh the cons, and that we are all for DNA databases because of all the things that they have to offer to people in society as a whole. Do you want us to stop this?